How did the simple act of staying home to save the world accidentally trigger a massive, cascading shortage of the exact invisible gas we desperately needed to actually save the world? This is Critical Path, where we explore stories and innovations about our global supply chain that connect our world to your everyday life. It is late 2020. Humanity is holding its collective breath, locked inside our homes, baking aggressively mediocre sourdough bread, and waiting for a miracle. And then, the scientists actually did it. They delivered the miracle. They cracked the code of the COVID-19 virus and developed a highly effective messenger RNA vaccine in record time. It was a triumph of human biochemistry, a genuine marvel of modern science, and a moment for the history books. We won! Roll the credits, let us all go outside again, right? Wrong. Because while the biochemical engineers were popping champagne, Viewari were staring into the abyss, sweating profusely, and realizing that manufacturing the cure was only half the battle. The true monster lurking in the dark was a logistical problem of extreme, unrelenting cold. Imagine a massive, global puzzle where every single piece must fit perfectly, or the entire picture dissolves into a puddle of useless room-temperature failure. The global campaign to distribute these vaccines represented the largest, most complex, and undeniably highest-stakes logistical operation in human history. We needed to provide at least a single dose of a vaccine to 7.8 billion people. Just pause for a second and try to visualize that number. 7.8 billion arms waiting for a tiny needle. The International Air Transport Association, the people who quite literally calculate how to fit everything into the sky, crunched the numbers. They calculated that to move this volume of medicine it would completely fill the cargo holds of 8,000 Boeing 747 jumbo jets. 8,000! That is an absolute armada of giant metal birds, packed to the brim with science juice. This alone represented the absolute largest single transport challenge the aviation industry had ever faced in its entire existence. But there was an incredible, seemingly impossible twist to this challenge. The most promising early vaccine candidates, particularly the messenger RNA vaccine, developed by the partnership of Pfizer and BioNTech, carried an incredibly temperamental profile. This vaccine was a diva. It was the Mariah Carey of modern medicine. It refused to exist in normal, comfortable conditions. To prevent the incredibly delicate synthetic mRNA strands from degrading and completely losing their efficacy, the medicine had to be kept at a continuous bone-chilling temperature of -94 degrees Fahrenheit. For our friends using the vastly more sensible metric system, that is -70 degrees Celsius. Let us put that temperature into perspective. -94 degrees Fahrenheit is colder than the surface of Antarctica in the dead of winter. It is an aggressively hostile level of cold. Standard human vaccine distribution networks, the supply chains we have relied on for decades to move flu shots and childhood immunizations, have traditionally operated within a comfortable, breezy domestic refrigerator range of 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. We built an entire global medical infrastructure around the concept of a nice, cool kitchen fridge. And then, overnight, the sudden pivot to an ultra-cold chain completely shattered those established paradigms. Pat Lennon, a brilliant cold chain expert with the Global Health Organization PATACE, famously described the sheer absurdity of this challenge. He said it was akin to carrying a cool glass of water all the way across a blazing desert, without allowing it to freeze, and without allowing it to heat up. It was a tightrope walk over an active logistical volcano. So, what is the primary weapon humanity chose to fight this epic thermal battle? How do you ship millions of tiny glass vials across deserts and oceans while pretending they are sitting at the South Pole? You use dry ice. Solid carbon dioxide. This glorious, frosty substance boasts a natural surface temperature of -109.3 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the only affordable, commercially scalable material capable of maintaining the subarctic conditions required inside those cardboard shipping containers. But as the world geared up for the absolute largest medical rollout in the history of our species, the logistics coordinators looked at their spreadsheets and discovered a terrifying, completely hidden bottleneck. The world was rapidly running out of dry ice. The very substance we explicitly needed to save millions of lives was vanishing from the open market at the exact historical moment demand was set to explode by over 1,100%. To really understand the sheer, mind-boggling magnitude of the hardware, the ice, and the random ancillaries required to move these vaccines at scale, let us look at the cumulative mass required just to transport a single shipment of 1 million doses. 1 million doses requires over 205 specialized thermal shipper boxes. These are not your average cardboard boxes, these are highly engineered coolers. Including the dry ice payload, those boxes weigh in at an estimated total weight of roughly 7.5 metric tons. And of that weight, approximately 4,715 kilograms is purely the dry ice payload needed to keep the diva medicine happy. But wait, you cannot just throw a vial at a person and hope it works. You need over 1.2 million syringes with needles, which, when combined with their requisite saline diluent, weigh an astonishing 16 metric tons. And you need 200,000 vials of that saline diluent, which equates to 400 liters of fluid. When you pack all of this together, the total shipping volume for just 1 million doses comes out to 269 cubic meters. That is the equivalent of completely filling 3 massive, 18-wheeler transport trucks. Again, that is just for 1 million doses. We needed to do this for 7.8 billion people. Now this brings us to the counterintuitive, massive, absolute brain breaker of a revelation. How did we run out of dry ice? For the average consumer walking down the street, it is completely natural to assume that if a society desperately needs more dry ice, the government can just call up the dry ice factory, speak to the chief dry ice officer, and demand they turn the dry ice machine up to maximum power. Just make more. It seems so simple. However, the counterintuitive, deeply frustrating truth of global industrial chemistry is that almost nobody on planet Earth produces carbon dioxide as a primary product. Carbon dioxide is the ultimate industrial middle child. It is a captured secondary waste byproduct from massive heavy industrial processes. Specifically, the vast majority of our food-grade and medical-grade carbon dioxide is captured during the production of ammonia for agricultural fertilizers and the production of ethanol for transportation fuel. In the United States alone, the massive ethanol industry is responsible for capturing roughly 40% of the entire national supply of carbon dioxide. That equates to anywhere between 3 million and 3.5 million tons of carbon dioxide annually. And right here lies the brilliant, dark irony and the massive aha moment of the entire pandemic crisis. Think back to the spring of 2020. What were we doing? We were staying home. The stay-at-home orders that were specifically implemented to mitigate the spread of the deadly virus inadvertently crippled the exact industrial processes required to secure the vaccine supply chain. Because millions of Americans were working from their couches in sweatpants and avoiding all unnecessary travel, national gasoline demand plummeted like a stone thrown into a pond. It dropped by up to 48%, falling from a pre-pandemic baseline of roughly 9.3 million barrels a day down to just 4.8 million barrels a day. Because federal regulations explicitly mandate that ethanol must be blended into standard automotive gasoline, this sudden, historic collapse in driving triggered a direct, catastrophic collapse in ethanol production. Nobody was driving, so nobody needed gasoline, so nobody needed ethanol, so nobody was producing ethanol waste. By mid-April of 2020, 75 ethanol plants across the American Midwest had completely idled their operations, shutting their doors and turning off the lights. Dozens more were running at severely reduced capacities. Consequently, 34 of the 45 ethanol plants in the United States that possessed the highly specialized equipment required to capture and sell carbon dioxide completely paused or heavily restricted their output. Actively capturing ethanol plants plummeted from around 45 to 50 plants down to just 11 plants operating normally. Monthly carbon dioxide capture rates fell from roughly 3.2 million tons a year down to 2.5 million tons. So, while the air in many major metropolitan cities was suddenly cleaner and clearer than it had been in decades due to the total lack of automotive exhaust, the supply of industrial carbon dioxide fell off an absolute cliff just as pharmaceutical companies desperately needed it the most. The situation was as completely preposterous as it was incredibly dangerous. Mark Saviner, the owner of Acme Dry Ice in Massachusetts, perfectly summarized this bizarre, agonizing predicament to the media. He stated that, without carbon dioxide, it is like being a McDonald's without hamburgers. You have the infrastructure, you have the demand, but you literally lack the foundational molecule required to do your job. This paradoxical catch-22 meant that every single conscientious citizen who bravely decided to stay home to flatten the curve was inadvertently contributing to a severe shortage of the very material needed to transport the cure that would allow them to leave their homes again. As a result, dry ice spot pricing went completely insane. Pre-pandemic, dry ice was dirt cheap, trading at roughly 11 cents per pound. During the peak of the pandemic disruption, that price skyrocketed to roughly $1.20 per pound. That is a mind-bending price increase of 990%. Dry ice suddenly became as coveted, rare, and ridiculously expensive as fine caviar. But let us assume you were a logistics coordinator who somehow managed to navigate this nightmare. Let us assume you found a supplier, paid the massive premium, and secured a mountain of dry ice. You are saved, right? Absolutely not. You have merely advanced to the next level of logistical hell. Because now, you have to load that dry ice onto an airplane. And when you do that, you run headfirst into the unrelenting laws of physics and international aviation safety regulations. Transporting millions of vaccine doses across vast oceans necessitated the heavy use of international air freight. However, dry ice is officially classified by international aviation authorities as a hazardous material when shipped by air. The hazard stems from the exact same chemical property that makes dry ice such a fantastic coolant in the first place. Because it is so cold, it does not melt into a liquid puddle. Instead, it sublimates. It transitions directly from a solid block of ice into heavy, invisible carbon dioxide gas. Inside the confined, heavily pressurized environment of a cargo aircraft flying at 30,000 feet, the rapid release of massive volumes of carbon dioxide gas is a literal death trap. As the dry ice sublimates, the heavy gas can easily displace the breathable oxygen in the cabin. If an aircraft carries too much dry ice, and the onboard ventilation systems cannot keep up with the sublimation rate, the flight crew can rapidly experience drowsiness, severe cognitive impairment, or complete and fatal asphyxiation in a matter of minutes. Furthermore, solid carbon dioxide actually evaporates significantly faster at higher altitudes where ambient atmospheric pressures are reduced, rapidly accelerating the release of this toxic gas. Oh, and there is also the minor, terrifying inconvenience that if carbon dioxide gas builds up inside a tightly sealed container without proper pressure venting, the internal pressure can cause the entire package to violently explode mid-flight. Because of these genuinely terrifying realities, the Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Transportation have traditionally placed incredibly strict, highly conservative caps on the volume of dry ice any single aircraft is legally allowed to carry. Under normal circumstances, even massive wide-body passenger jets were typically restricted to carrying no more than 3,000 pounds of dry ice per single flight. However, a full cargo load of Pfizer thermal shippers required a volume of dry ice that vastly, laughably exceeded these standard legal safety limits. To prevent the entire global rollout from grinding to a catastrophic halt before it even left the tarmac, a dedicated team of Federal Aviation Administration specialists had to work around the clock with commercial airlines to completely rewrite the rules of engagement on the fly. The Federal Aviation Administration issued emergency safety alerts for operators, frantically detailing complex mathematical formulas that calculated new allowable dry ice loads based on an aircraft's specific fresh air exchange rate and the total volume of the aircraft fuselage. To give you an idea of how precise this math had to be, the Federal Aviation Administration ran urgent tests at their William J. Hughes Technical Center, simulating flight pressures at an altitude of 8,000 feet, or 10.9 pounds per square inch of pressure. They measured the exact sublimation rates of different shipping boxes. A large thermal container carrying roughly 200 pounds of dry ice had a minimum sublimation rate of 0.320% per hour, and a maximum rate of 0.680% per hour, meaning it lost an average mass of 1.045 pounds of dry ice every single hour. A medium container, holding about 45 pounds, lost mass at a rate of 0.430% to 0.740% per hour, losing roughly 0.259 pounds an hour. Another type of medium container, holding 45 pounds, sublimated at a rate between 0.481% and 0.932%, losing 0.294 pounds an hour. Armed with this hyperspecific data, United Airlines famously obtained a deeply unprecedented special exemption to carry up to 15,000 pounds of dry ice on dedicated cargo charter flights running between Chicago and Brussels. They effectively quintupled the normal safety limits. To execute these massive flights safely without turning the cockpit into a gas chamber, the pilots had to ensure that all air conditioning packs and auxiliary power units were operating at absolute, screaming maximum capacity from the moment they began taxiing to the moment of touchdown, just to continuously flush the sublimating gas out of the cabin. This extreme sensitivity of the ultra-cold chain meant that if the cooling mechanisms failed at any point during this precarious journey, a desperate race against the clock immediately began. The margins of safety were absolutely razor thin. And there is perhaps no better, more cinematic illustration of this fragility than the events that unfolded in Seattle, Washington, on the cold night of January 28, 2021. It was approximately 11 p.m. Most of the city was asleep. Suddenly, exhausted hospital officials at the University of Washington Medical Center and the Swedish Medical Center discovered an absolute nightmare. A specialized ultra-cold freezer, tasked with storing a massive batch of the precious Moderna vaccine, had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. The temperature inside the unit was rapidly rising. Because the hospitals completely lacked an immediate surplus of medical-grade dry ice to pack around the compromised trays, a direct result of the cascading national shortages, over 1,300 doses of the highly coveted vaccine were suddenly exposed to ambient room temperatures and began to quickly thaw. Under strict medical protocols, once these specific messenger RNA vaccines begin to thaw, they start a lethal countdown timer. According to clinical guidelines, a Moderna vaccine in an unpunctured vial can survive in a refrigerator between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius for up to 30 days. But once it hits room temperature, and especially after that first needle puncture, it has a strict expiration limit of just 6 hours. The Pfizer vaccine is slightly different. An unpunctured vial can last 10 weeks in a refrigerator, but at room temperature, or after the first puncture, it has a strict limit of 12 hours. Refusing to let this precious, life-saving cargo end up in a biohazard trash can, the healthcare workers in Seattle did something truly extraordinary. They embraced the chaos. They took to social media in the absolute middle of the night, frantically pleading with anyone and everyone in the city who could safely get to a clinic to show up immediately for an emergency, completely unscheduled inoculation. By midnight, an incredible scene was unfolding. A massive line of hopeful vaccine recipients, many still in their pajamas and winter coats, was snaking out of the hospital doors and winding deep through the dark, freezing parking lots. Hospital staffers who had already been working grueling shifts since 7 a.m. refused to go home. They frantically recruited pharmacists, off-duty nurses, and completely random civilian volunteers to help manage the overwhelming chaos. A local firefighter simply appeared out of the ether to help safely direct the massive influx of traffic, and one hospital staffer's boyfriend ended up managing and organizing the massive queue of people. Working furiously in a desperate, adrenaline-fueled race against a hard 5:30 a.m. expiration deadline, the exhausted but determined medical teams successfully administered every single one of those 1,300 doses. Not a single drop was wasted. This heart-pounding midnight scramble beautifully encapsulates the profound stress that the dry ice shortage and the extreme cold chain fragility placed on local communities. Without adequate localized reserves of dry ice to act as a buffer during equipment failures, the entire massive global distribution campaign was operating completely without a safety net. But humanity, when pushed into a corner by a virus, a gas shortage, and aviation mathematics, is remarkably stubborn. Faced with the crushing reality of a massive dry ice shortage and the unrelenting physics of aviation gas limits, the global logistics and materials science industries did exactly what they do best. They furiously innovated their way out of the corner. The crisis forced an incredibly rapid evolution in cold chain technologies that effectively decoupled critical medical supply chains from the entirely unpredictable waste byproducts of the ethanol industry. For instance, the logistics giant United Parcel Service recognized early on that depending entirely on external, third-party dry ice vendors at its primary air hub in Louisville, Kentucky, represented a completely unacceptable operational risk. In response to the market collapse, the company invested heavily in manufacturing their own hardware, building machines capable of producing up to 1,200 pounds of dry ice per hour, directly on-site at its massive Worldport facility. This marked the absolute first time in the company's long history that it produced its own dry ice rather than relying on external suppliers. By producing its own ice, United Parcel Service could reliably re-ice sensitive shipments transitioning through its sprawling air and ground networks, and they even had enough volume to sell their surplus dry ice directly to local hospitals and rural clinics that were desperately struggling to source the material. Simultaneously, brilliant engineering firms began rolling out high-tech alternatives that bypassed the need for dry ice altogether. A company named Sterling Ultracold developed ultralight, highly portable freezers that could magically maintain temperatures as incredibly low as -112 degrees Fahrenheit, simply by being plugged into a standard wall outlet or a portable generator. These portable units became massive, game-changing assets for remote, rural hospitals and small clinics that completely lacked the massive, specialized power grids required to run full-sized industrial cryogenic freezers. In the aviation sector, companies like SkyCell utilized highly advanced artificial intelligence to rapidly test thousands of virtual shipping container prototypes in parallel, allowing them to bring highly advanced, next-generation shipping containers to the global market in a matter of weeks rather than months or years. These incredibly advanced containers featured complex, interlocking vacuum-insulated panels that miraculously reduced the sublimation loss rate of dry ice to absolute minimums. By successfully extending the hold time of a single, standard payload of dry ice to over 120 hours, these systems ensured that fragile vaccine shipments could easily survive complex, multi-leg global journeys without the constant, desperate need for dry ice recharging. Meanwhile, on the African continent, a South African natural gas and helium producer named Renogen developed an incredibly clever, science fiction-level solution called the cryovac system. Completely bypassing the heavy, electricity-guzzling production lines needed for dry ice, Renogen created a revolutionary transport method powered entirely by liquid helium. Because liquid helium can naturally reach temperatures vastly colder than solid carbon dioxide, the cryovac system could keep delicate vaccine doses frozen solid for up to 30 continuous days, without requiring any external power source or gas replenishment. Furthermore, because it relied on helium and did not release toxic heavy carbon dioxide gas into the air, the cryovac system incredibly allowed a single aircraft to safely carry up to 3.6 million vaccine doses on a single flight, compared to a miserable, heavily restricted 40,000 doses when relying on standard dry ice packaging. Finally, the incredible health logistics company Zipline partnered directly with Pfizer to liberate entire populations from the oppressive constraints of the cold chain entirely. Using fleets of highly advanced autonomous drones, Zipline was able to literally fly sensitive vaccine doses from centralized supercooled hubs directly to remote, difficult-to-reach rural medical clinics across unforgiving terrain. Because the drones flew through the air and could cover massive long distances in mere minutes, the fragile vaccines spent virtually no time in transit, allowing small clinics to receive and successfully administer the doses on the exact same day, without ever needing to procure a single ounce of dry ice or invest thousands of dollars in expensive ultra-cold freezers. The great dry ice shortage of the pandemic era serves as an absolutely masterclass illustration of the profound, deeply complex, and often entirely invisible interdependencies of our modern global economy. Humanity found itself locked in a high-stakes, breathless race against time to distribute billions of doses of highly sensitive messenger RNA vaccines that strictly required temperatures colder than a brutal winter in Antarctica. The most obvious, highly logical solution was to pack these sophisticated thermal shippers with blocks of solid carbon dioxide. However, we all learned through a series of complex, painful economic mechanisms that dry ice is not a primary product that you can simply conjure out of thin air. Instead, it is a captured waste byproduct, heavily reliant on entirely unrelated industries like ethanol manufacturing and gasoline consumption. The massive, completely perspective-shifting irony of this entire saga was the stark realization that by bravely staying home and driving significantly less to save the planet and flatten the curve, human beings inadvertently choked off the exact gasoline demand that kept those massive ethanol plants running. This paradoxically caused a severe, global shortage of the very carbon dioxide gas needed to ship the life-saving vaccines. Without that invisible gas, logistics providers were left staring helplessly at empty cardboard shipping boxes and a rapidly expiring mountain of highly perishable medicine. Ultimately, this unprecedented global crisis was narrowly averted through an incredible combination of sheer human grit, brilliant mechanical engineering, and a collective willingness to completely break and rewrite established rules. The global supply chain world learned a vital, unforgettable lesson. It could absolutely no longer afford to treat critical medical infrastructure as a mere afterthought or a convenient byproduct of the massive fossil fuel economy. By rapidly pivoting to completely on-site production, developing portable helium-powered superfreezers, and utilizing autonomous drone delivery networks, humanity successfully bridged the terrifying sub-zero gap and successfully delivered the cure. The hard-fought lessons learned in this frigid, stressful crucible have permanently and completely altered how the entire world approaches cold chain logistics, powerfully proving that even when the entire planet goes completely flat, chaotic and cold, human ingenuity can always find a brilliantly bizarre way to put the fizz back in the solution. So what do you think? We just saw how a completely unexpected drop in daily driving caused a massive, life-threatening disruption to a completely unrelated medical vaccine supply chain. What other bizarre, deeply hidden connections do you think currently exist in our massive global supply chain that are just waiting to be completely disrupted by a single, seemingly harmless everyday event? Drop your most creative and chaotic theories in the comments section below. Thanks for listening and watching. Please like and subscribe, and make sure to check out our other videos about the global supply chain.